Again, hello and welcome. We're going to move into our lightning talk presentations now. So we have 6 presentations lined up and each will have 7 minutes. Please post your questions in the chat and we will answer them live at the end of the session. And with no time wasted, let's go ahead and get started. Our first talk of the day is creating libraries where neurodiverse workers can thrive by Celia Emmelhains, who is the anthropology librarian at UC Berkeley, and Erin Pappas, the librarian for the humanities at the University of Virginia.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Celia Emmelhains, and I'm here with Erin Pappas. We both work in academic libraries, and we both identify as ADHD and on the autism spectrum. So a few years ago, a friend asked me about someone who had interviewed with their library. Do you think they even want this job, they said? They didn't seem chatty and excited, and they didn't mail us a handwritten thank you note. I was surprised. What this person didn't realize is that their expectations enacted a kind of implicit bias. They expected candidates to know informal rules and perform outward emotions in order to get hired. But this expectation could have a disparate impact on candidates on the autism spectrum and on other neurodiverse workers. So how can you help shape your library into a place where neurodiverse people can thrive? That's what we're here today to talk about.
So this is something called a neurodiversity wheel. We're using the term neurodiversity. It's typically contrasted with neurotypicality or neurotypical. By that we mean people who have been diagnosed, and in this we're kind of including informal self-diagnosis as well, with conditions such as attention deficit disorder, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, related processing disorders, and difficulties such as sensory processing disorder and Tourette's syndrome. Next slide. Next slide, please. Great. Oh, I think there was one before that, but it's just some numbers. Essentially, approximately 10 to 20% of American workers are considered neurodiverse. There's a lot of reasons that the numbers are hard to pin down. One of which is that there's a lot of comorbidity with diagnoses. The other is that this kind of information is not tracked in a kind of more holistic sort of way, which is of course contrasted again with neurotypical workers, people who don't have a diagnosis. So you may not recognize that you or others struggle with disabilities. Some estimates place that 90% of disabilities are invisible, and a lot of these neurotypicals are included in that. Next slide. And then we have many, because again, for 2 librarians, we were totally unable to find any data that was really solid at all. But reports from America, the UK, Australia, suggest that between 20 and 80%, so many of neurodiverse workers are either or underemployed. Next slide, please. So neurodiversity includes a lot of stuff, which we've kind of put up here, but it includes things like processing one's senses, organizing and planning, executive functioning, connecting to people, and regulating emotions. Next slide. And so neurodiverse library workers may struggle with a lot of these different tasks. This can include interpreting social cues, following unwritten rules, focusing appropriately, tick management, managing ticks, processing information, and adapting to environments. So what can we do about this? Next slide.
If you're neurodiverse or you suspect that you may be, then next slide. You don't have to disclose. You may want to seek advice before disclosing in the interview process or workplace. So you can disclose and choose to ask for accommodations. It depends on how safe your workplace is. That may come with some risk as well. The other thing you can do is you can ask for accommodations, and that could be formally or informally. Depending on what the specific challenge or disability that you have is, you could ask for a schedule that reduces sensory overwhelm from a commute. You could ask for an ability to moderate lighting or glare in your workspace, noise reducing headphones, private spaces to decompress. And like I said, these can be formal or informal. I asked for a schedule that helped me to focus and lamps to reduce glare from fluorescent lights before I even knew that formal accommodations were a thing. So you need to just check with your library and see what that process is.
So if this is all new to you, you can of course be an ally. Next slide, please. So you can read up on neurodivergence in the workplace and how you can better support candidates and colleagues who process information differently. Things not to do, right, is obviously to assume that you know everything about people before you speak to them, so take the time to pause before you comment and learn more. Definitely don't assume too that people who have ADHD or autism in particular are mostly white men, which harms people of color who face larger social and financial barriers to diagnoses and support. And then don't doubt people's challenges just because they're working overtime to mask or otherwise hide their disability. And then please do not ask other people to disclose or armchair diagnose others. You don't look autistic, you don't look this, you don't appear that way, but you blah, blah, blah. Next slide.
Another way that you can get involved in supporting colleagues and candidates is to advocate for space planning. So when it comes up and you have the opportunity to change not just the public workspaces, which many of us are aware about, that people with autism might need accommodations, but also to see that library workers themselves can adjust their level of stimulation, whether they're overstimulated or understimulated by a standard office or library desk layout. For instance, those with Tourette's syndrome might need a private place to work on a day when their tics are especially strong, or those with sensory overload may need to be able to adjust their lighting and sound. Another thing you can do is to advocate for equitable policies and practices to ensure that this, among many other things, is included as we're designing our libraries. This could mean hosting trainings on neurodiversity, developing explicit criteria for hiring and promotion, which will help people who can't read unwritten rules, giving interview questions or even a virtual walkthrough in advance for people who don't deal well with uncertainty, and assigning mentors to help workers as they advance through their careers. This is just a small sample, so if you have other tips or from your experience, you're welcome to tweet them out using the hashtag NeuroDiveLines. And finally, there are far more resources on this than we have time for today. We will share these out shortly and encourage you to share out your own tips with this hashtag. Thank you, and we really mean thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, and perfect timing, may I say. Right, so thank you, Celia and Erin. So next, joining us from San Francisco State University, we have Faith Rusk, the Lower Division Research Assistant and Instruction Coordinator, Bill Jacobs, the Associate Librarian in the Research and Instruction Division, and Joe Daniels, the Senior Assistant Librarian in Research and Instruction. And we can all give them a round of applause, virtual applause, for starting their presentation, creating an anti-racist teaching observation rubric.
All right, hello everyone. We're from San Francisco State University Library, which occupies Ramaytush Ohlone land. My name is Faith Rusk and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Joe Daniels, my pronouns are he, him.
And I am Bill Jacobs. My pronouns are also he, him.
So we're here to share our process and the progress we've made in creating an anti-racist teaching peer observation rubric.
Thank you, Faith. So what was our process? How we as a team collaborated on the work? We thought first to review the literature to inform our work going forward and endeavored to focus on searches in the areas of anti-racist teaching, critical pedagogy, teaching that is inclusive, equitable, culturally responsive, and feminist. This was done to compile a list of themes and specific elements that would end up comprising our rubric. We found quite early on in the research process that focusing specifically on library instruction in these themes was more difficult than searching them generally, and further realized once we began to share and talk over what we had found that our search was not going to be comprehensive, and there were certainly materials on these themes that we did not cover and utilize in our process. This presents an opportunity, if this rubric were to be used outside of SF State, to customize the elements of the rubric informed by literature relevant to the local instruction. Next slide, please. So the rubric itself, we completed our review of the literature and found as a team that we could group those relevant portions of the readings by themes. The themes mapped well onto the rubric as categories, and we utilized them as such. So the rubric is comprised of these 4 categories: student engagement, student-centered instruction, which has subcategories of facilitating a student-centered environment, building mutual trust and fostering positive relationships, encouraging reflection. The second category is anti-racist content. The third is collaboration. And the fourth is accessible and inclusive classroom.
Next slide, please. All right, so now let's look at the rubric. It does not share nicely in a slide. So we have a tiny URL here, and I've also shared it in chat. so you all can pull it up and take a look at it yourselves. As you're looking at it, I think you might notice that it's quite long and that there's a lot there. So we also wanted to discuss how we envision this tool being used. And I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. It's not intended to be boxes that folks can check. Using it that way, we think wouldn't really be particularly helpful. So what we hope for instead is that this can serve as a framework for comments and a space to provide substantive qualitative feedback. So this slide is a demonstration of what that might look like. This is an example from our own observations of each other as we've kind of tested out how this would go. So I know this font is small, the particular text here doesn't matter too much, but we wanted to share an example of what using this rubric could look like. So you can see that not every row has comments. If something isn't relevant to the session, it can stay blank. There's no judgment in not having all of these things. And it's hopefully quite flexible, right? In this example, there's a suggestion for something that isn't present, but could be included. And in the same line, in the same row or category, there's also something that the instructor did well, that we thought this was great and we wanted to celebrate it. So to my mind, it's kind of similar to the Universal Design for Learning rubric in the sense that you aren't always going to have all of these things, but you want to think about all of them. Our hope is that by providing many different ways that one can make your classroom inclusive within these sort of overarching categories, ways that we can be inclusive, accessible, and student-centered, we hope that it also makes it easier to jump in and provide feedback and potentially use it for your own self-reflection and planning as well. Next slide.
So it's important to acknowledge that as we were creating this, that we all fell short of this idea and that we have work to do. There's no preaching going on here from this rubric. A running theme we found in the critical library instruction literature that we read, including a talk yesterday, was that the one-shot library instruction is the biggest hurdle we have to including this sort of material, anything anti-racist, anything critical in our teaching. Unfortunately, that's what most of us are stuck with. And we're hoping that this rubric is a good tool to help us do the best we can under these circumstances. There are many, many things on this rubric, a wide range of possible activities to give you many approaches to these same goals. And you can't do all of these things in library instruction session, but the goal is to encourage you to focus more in these areas. And we hope the rubric can be a tool to encourage that. We came into this looking to create a tool for peer observation, but we discovered that it was also valuable for self-reflection and inspiration. We came across many things that we hadn't thought of doing before. And we think you will too, if you take a look at this. And so you'll find some things that you can slip into your instruction or find new ways to do that same old database instruction in a new, better way. And just get a little bit better at this. And this is really what we're hoping for here. Okay, next slide.
All right, so where we are, we have tested this rubric amongst the three of us, and we're ready to share it with our faculty for feedback and hopefully implementation within our library. We are also sharing it with you all. We've put a Creative Commons license on it, and we hope that folks can take it and use it and adjust it with your team to fit your particular context and your needs. So thank you all for letting us share this project with you. On the next slide, we've shared our contact information, and we've also provided a link to a Google folder, which I'll put in chat as well, that has our rubric, our bibliography, and our slides. Okay, thank you. That's all from us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faith, Bill, and Joe. And I'm leaving the contact info slide up here, hopefully long enough. Sorry about the glitch in the beginning with my slides. All right, so next we have Stand Up and Speak Out Social Justice Series, which will be presented to us by Sherelle Walker, the librarian from the Borough of Manhattan Community College. All right, take it away, Sherelle.
Thank you so much. So I want to talk to you about this series that we put on at BMCC. You can go to the next slide. So the purpose of this series was to get students involved in the issues and to teach them what they can do in regards to how they're feeling about it, how they can get active. Some of the basics of the series is, first off, I have no money. I'm an outreach librarian and I have no budget. So I had to make sure all of my participants were volunteers. I wanted to offer different topics for each session, so that way I had a broad spectrum of thoughts and topics and discussions every semester. We opened it up to everyone in our community. I am looking into opening it up to a much broader national space, but still working on that. In order to get students to come, we offered what's called CCT credit. Now, at our school, that is co-curricular transit credit that you can put on your transcript to show that you are involved in different curricular activities. And in regards to finding presenters, like I said, I had no money. I reached out to people who I thought would have something to say. Next slide. This was our first session. It was based on activism. And our speaker, Professor Williams, spoke about how students and faculty members can get involved in the legal way, such as running for local offices and making sure they knew their rights in regards to if they were ever arrested. Next slide. He also taught them about power relations and how it affects racial inequality, especially in regards to not only who your superiors are, but the superiors in New York State and in our local government, and how you could get your voice heard in regards to these ways. Next slide. Our next event was on anonymity and activism. As we all know, there has been a lot going on in regards to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those in regards to what information they are giving to the government about people who are posting on their programs. We try to school students in regards to what privacy really means and how to maintain their anonymity and still be active. Next slide. Again, this was back when the FBI were able to track down some protesters in regards to Apple helping them by helping locate their cell phones and things like that. So we wanted to make sure students were aware of this, especially because many of our students did join protests all around the United States. Next slide. Our next event was about student success and equity. Now at BMCC, we are largely made up of minority students. And as I'm sure many people are aware of, it can be very hard for minority students to not only get into college, but to make sure they are having the same opportunities as their non-minority counterparts. Next slide. This was actually one of our most popular events, and to this date, it's the one that we've had the most participants on. This was on systemic racism and self-care. We've had a lot of students and faculty members who felt traumatized as a result of all of the systemic racism that happened both earlier this year and last year. We wanted to give them some ways to not only help themselves, but to help professors help their students who were dealing with these very difficult issues. Next slide. This was from a visitor from our mayor's office. Again, he came just because I was very lucky that they were able to come. Many of our students belong to immigrant communities and they weren't sure what their rights were in regards to protecting themselves in regards to COVID-19. In addition, as you may or may not know, the people who were impacted by COVID-19 and large amounts of people who got sick were minorities and immigrants who couldn't afford to stay home and stay out of harm's way during the height of the pandemic. So we wanted to make sure they knew what their options were in regards to what was available to them. Next slide. Now, our future events, again, we're still in the works. Like I said, I'm reaching out to different volunteers, but actually later on today, we will be having an event on homelessness and how it impacts community college students. And then later on this semester, we'll be having a presenter speak about the closed Rikers movement. If anybody doesn't know, Rikers is a very large prison that is in upstate New York. It has been cited for a number of health code violations, and it's become very problematic, and there is a large movement to close it. We will be having that event a little bit later on this semester. If you have any questions about my events or how I was able to plan them, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about them. And if you feel that you have something that you would like to add to my events, if there is something that you would like to discuss during a social justice event, let me know. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It's great to hear about your work. All right, so next we have Using Science Fiction Stories to Teach Critical Information Literacy by Linnea Minnick, the Information Literacies Librarian at Sewanee, the University of the South.
Hi, my name is Linnea Minnick. My pronouns are she, her. I'm speaking to you from the traditional land of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Yuchi. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat because I realized I didn't put it on any of my slides, so I'll put it in again at the end. Next slide, please. This past summer, I read Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. In this book about activism and working toward change, something Brown said really stood out to me. Brown writes that science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. I love science fiction, and I read a lot of books by authors like Ursula Le Guin and N.K. Jemisin. These authors are talking about what the future might look like and how we're affecting it, often specifically addressing ideas of justice, diversity, and information access. Next slide. In Emergent Strategy, Brown discusses the work of Octavia Butler. She says that rather than narrowing into one path forward, Octavia's leaders were creating more and more possibilities. Not one perfect path forward, but an abundance of futures, of ways to manage resources together, to be brilliant together. So these ideas really stood out to me because I've been using science fiction stories in my classes to help my students imagine the future and see current issues in a new light. Science fiction opens the way to reimagine our world through a new paradigm. It helps me think about my responsibilities and the way I'm engaging with problems in the world now. These are exactly the things Brown and Butler are talking about, and these are the things I want my students to understand. Next slide. In the fall of 2019, when I was still adjuncting in English composition, I was teaching an assignment that required students to research a controversial topic and write an argument. This probably sounds really familiar to any of you familiar with first year writing, because this is a very typical assignment there. These papers often oversimplify the issues and break them into a pro-con binary. In order to avoid these pitfalls, I designed an innovation project. This project encouraged students to focus their arguments on presenting innovative solutions for hard problems and used science fiction stories as a way to practice new ways of thinking about solutions. Next slide. Through this project, I wanted to help my students develop a critical consciousness. The idea of conscientiousao, described by Paulo Freire. Next slide. In their chapter, Depositories of Knowledge, Library Instruction, and the Development of Critical Consciousness, Kopp and Olsen-Kopp apply Freire's ideas to library instruction. They write, awareness of and reflection on bigger pictures and how we reproduce, negotiate, or resist them seems to be an important aspect of critical consciousness. And again, critical consciousness develops when real problems are posed in a dialogic atmosphere with all their ethical, moral, and human dimensions. Next slide, please. Obviously, we need to talk about real problems and help students think through difficult ideas. In my class, I tried to choose stories that dealt with ideas of justice, race, knowledge, and equity, stories that showed a hopeful future. These stories helped us talk about topics that might otherwise have been too abstract or overwhelming. Through these stories, we were able to gain a new perspective on current problems and see the bigger picture. Even though this was science fiction, it was a way to bring in real problems and talk about them together in a dialogic atmosphere. One of the stories that I brought in talked about a hurricane. I believe the story is set on St. Thomas, but that fall, like a hurricane had happened on another island similar to St. Thomas. And these stories allowed us to talk about that and talk about like how things could have gone better with kind of the ideas of the technology and the future in science fiction. So these stories allowed us to imagine what change might look like outside the smaller solutions we saw discussed in the news. Next slide. I brought these stories into my library classroom in the spring of 2021. I taught Library 101, a credit-bearing library class focusing on information literacy topics like navigating information online, access to information, etc. This focus really gave these stories a new meaning. Students were eager to connect the readings to topics from the class or their experience with information in their daily lives. We used Perusall, a social reading platform that allows students to comment on the readings and see and respond to other people's comments. Students would highlight something from the text and say, oh, this shows the difference between information and knowledge. Or now I'm realizing how much information I get from smart speakers. I'm still working on this, but I think these stories can really make it easier to talk through more abstract information literacy concepts like research as inquiry and authority being constructed or contextual. Next slide. So these are some of the stories that I used. I'm not going to go into this very much because obviously I could talk about this a lot. One thing I will say is that I have found that students preferred stories with more emotional realism. So I've tried using some stories that were a little more parable-ish, kind of like Twilight Zone-y, and students didn't like those very much. So I'm also very happy to hear recommendations for other stories and to talk about all of this more. But for now, let's go on to the next slide. So what do these stories do? These are problem-posing visionary fiction. They give problems and allow students to experiment and discuss solutions. They're presenting ideas in new contexts, and therefore students are able to see these issues and topics from a new perspective, revisioning them in a way that can give new insight. These stories also ask for a response from the reader. We can't really read these passively in the way that we might read other fantasy or something. They prompt readers to think about what they would do and how they would respond in this situation. In their comments, students especially focused on ideas of privacy, comparing elements of the stories to smart speakers, cookies, etc. And it seemed likely that students would reevaluate their information behavior in light of the new connections they had made. So students didn't always respond to these stories in the way I expected. I'm definitely still working through how to bring these ideas about problem posing and critical consciousness into my classroom, but these stories help me apply abstract ideas and theories to actions I'm taking that will affect the future. Reading science fiction helps us imagine the future, and that can help us work to change things. As Adrienne Marie Brown says, all organizing is science fiction. Next slide. Here are my references. Next slide. And as I said, I would welcome any recommendations that anyone has about stories to have my students talk about. And I'm going to put my email address in one more time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linnea. Right, so next we are going to turn it over to Michael Scholenbeck, who is the public health librarian at UC Berkeley with hashtag Cite Black Women Public Health.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I do not have slides. So I'm going to be presenting a work in progress. A few years ago, Dr. Kristen Smith created Cite Black Women as a campaign to push people to engage in the radical praxis of citation that acknowledges and honors Black women's transnational intellectual production. Particularly, people in the academy should reflect on their everyday practices of citation. And because of this, the Cite Black Women Collective came up with these 5 guiding principles that you can see on the screen. Around the same time, Drs. Brittany Williams and Dr. Joan Collier co-created Cite a Sister to give credit and thanks for all of the often used but rarely credited hard work by Black women, and to discuss ways to support and uplift Black women in daily life. I heard Dr. Smith speak at a conference a few months ago, and she was like, yeah, create works based on this idea. So I did. So I created a database that you can see here. It currently has about 200 and I believe 30 or so names listed. I've included folks who actually have not already authored articles, although I'm not sure if that's gonna, I'm gonna keep that or not. But basically I have a name, an institution, and then a link that will take you to a PubMed search for articles by this author. Now, public health is very broad, and a lot of folks publish in places that are outside of PubMed's scope. So I also put in a Google Scholar link to capture either citations, or if people have their Google Scholar page like this person does, then I've included that in the link. So a few thoughts on technical things. If you're familiar with the way PubMed searches, if you search on a full name, you'll probably miss older articles because back in the day, PubMed used first and middle initials only. So this could be a problem for people who have been publishing for a very long time. As well as if the author is part of a long list of authors, the older PubMed citations only listed the first, I don't recall the number, but the first number of authors, not all the authors. So if you're number 25 in the list, I might not capture you with my search. Going back to the database here, I've likely missed several, or in fact, many people on this list. I've tried to include folks who seemingly identify as Black women, and that is often just based on me looking at a photograph, right? So it's possible there's people on this list who maybe aren't appropriate to be on this page. Name changes are not taken into account unless I happen to know. So for example, we have a UC Berkeley scholar who recently changed her name a few years ago. So I can include a search in, for example, whoops, wrong one, in PubMed that would include both names. I think the next step in something like this would be to, and I kind of started doing it here on the right, is to include some subject keywords. And I've just barely started doing that, and it's not a controlled vocabulary. And I'm not quite sure how to do this. I could use controlled vocabulary, but which one? And I have some problems with things like PubMed's controlled vocabulary, being a hierarchical system and all that. And I'm just not sure it would truly reflect the scholarship of these folks. But it would be, PubMed is easy to mine, and I can, there's websites where you can plug in a bunch of PubMed searches and it will show you, what are the most common keywords and subject terms and title words and so forth. So it would be very easy to do that especially for folks who are well represented in PubMed. So that's the part that I'm still pondering, but I think that a database like this, could possibly help with increasing citing of Black women. But I think it could certainly help increase knowledge of the work and scholarship that these folks do, and may help in determining unique or salient characteristics of this work. So And that would be when the subject keywords come into play. On the right here, I have some of the websites that are sources of some of the names I've included. Another next step would be to go to the websites of every school of public health, at least that I know of or can find, and go through the faculty lists on those web pages to add more names. Every time I look at this, I add more names. I'll put this up on the web at some point, but I'd be happy to share it, with any folks who are interested. And that's the end of mine.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm just going to turn off my timer. All right, we have plenty of time for Q&A, so that's awesome. And again, if you have any questions or if anything comes up, please put it in the chat so that I can ask the presenters. All right, I'll just go ahead and take our questions in order of presentation. So Celia and Erin, I'm coming back to you. All right, so this is from a committee member. I didn't realize that learning disabilities, or what I thought were learning disabilities, i.e. dyslexia, were part of being neurodiverse. Have you seen any policies that address supporting folks in the library world?
That's a good question.
I don't think so. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Not that I know. I mean, again, we didn't comb anybody's, like particular admin stuff or anything like that. I necessarily see anything to do.
There are general, I haven't seen things specifically for the library workplace. There are general advice on ways that you can, not expect people to process things auditorily or by text if that's a way that they're just not strong at processing. So I think, honestly, during the pandemic, the fact that more places have moved to have multiple modes of getting out information has been really helpful for people, and I hope that will continue.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go through each and then I'll come back if we have time so that at least everyone gets it.
That's totally fine.
All right, so this one is for Faith, Bill, and Joe. Thank you for sharing your rubric with a Creative Commons license. How are you assessing its efficacy, if at all? Do you have a student or faculty feedback on changes that you've made in your instruction since starting to use it?
We haven't really started using it yet. We're bringing it to our faculty to sort of propose that we start using it in our own sort of observation, like peer observation process that we have to do. And we hadn't really thought about assessment. So thank you for asking that question, because now it's something that we can consider along with, we're basically trying to increase our assessment efforts across the board throughout the library. And so I think, like looking at the feedback from the instruction sessions, sort of when we make this pivot, could be a really interesting thing to look at. So I don't know that I exactly answered your question because we aren't really doing it yet, but I appreciate it because I think we would like to definitely keep try and assess how it's going.
Thank you, Faith. All right, so here's a question for Sherelle. Was it a challenge to find and hold on to volunteer presenters?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had to reach out to many of the departments within my school, people who I already had good working relationships with, and I put out the call to a variety of different places. But generally, once someone agreed to it, I sent them an email roughly every week until the actual event, just to be like, how you doing? You want to send me your slides? Are we good? Just to make sure I kept them.
Thank you. All right, and now for Linnea. All right, this is so cool. Do you have a syllabus or summary of assignments others might be able to borrow from?
Okay, this is a great question. And I will say in each class, I used about 4 or 5 short stories. I didn't use only short stories, but what I've been doing in the last few minutes is putting together a Google Doc where I'm going to write down the short stories I used and some notes about them, because for one thing, this is really helpful for me to have. And I've had these ideas in my head But I'm also sharing the link to the doc for anyone to come back and look at it when it is more complete. I will say, I'm going to share another link here. In my first class, the actual English composition class, I relied heavily on this project that Verge did. And then in my second class, I did start to bring in at least one short story from Octavia's Brood, which is a collection partly put together by Adrienne Marie Brown that has short stories written by activists.
Thanks, Linnea. And you also completely just answered the next question for you, which was, have you read Octavia's Brood?
Oh, yeah.
All right, Michael, is your database publicly available?
Well, I mean, I haven't made it publicly available yet, but I guess I could. It's just a Google Doc. I kind of wanted to finish it a little more before I did that, but so that's where I am right now. I think I'll pause a little bit longer before I share the link to the world. But if you want to reach out to me individually, then that would probably be fine.
Thanks, Michael. And since that was kind of a short question, I'll go ahead and ask you another.
Okay.
Do you think that it would be a good idea to check in with folks who you are identifying as Black to make sure that that is how they identify? And what about folks who don't look Black but identify as Black?
Yeah. For part one of that question, then maybe if I'm going to make this thing truly public, I would want to do that. Which of course would, be significant work, but it would probably be the right thing to do. For part two of that question, well, that is hard. And unless I personally know or know of the person or, see them somehow like identifying, in some public space, then I wouldn't capture them. So a lot of the sources that I put up at the end there, which that I can share, of course, they're like websites of, Black women in public health or something like that. So my assumption is they all thusly identify. But those are good questions that don't have perfect answers.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you.
All right, we still have about 13 minutes left. So I'm gonna head back to Celia and Erin. So have you come across anything that talked about neurodiversity being judged unfairly in a workplace that is emphasizing emotional intelligence?
Such an important question, and it's been on my mind since we proposed this talk, because I think there's a real balance here between making sure that workplaces are safe, accessible, and inclusive for everyone, and recognizing that some people have disabilities that make them off-kilter socially. And a rather embarrassing example that comes to mind is that when I was younger and worked in a museum, I once said something inappropriate in front of a group of people, not realizing that it had a disparate impact. And I think it was handled really well, which is why I raise it. The people cut me off, and then they talked to me in private. They issued a warning, and they had me apologize to some people in the room. And it was done with compassion of, you may not realize the impact, but at the same point, we need to publicly support everybody in this room, and the things that you're saying aren't doing that. And so I hope that that kind of thing can be a model for others when this comes up.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things we were talking about is how this kind of fits more broadly into the idea of, fit and culture and norms and all of those sorts of things, and how those can really vary from place to place. But, typically speaking, they're designed for a certain way of thinking, a certain way of processing, a certain way of engaging with the world. And it's so hard. Like, this is not the kind of thing it's easy to like write policy for, because in so many ways it's so particular and so specific to individuals. But I think what Celia's saying about that like broader idea of like compassion and understanding and like not forcing people to kind of, like only do the self-advocacy work and the self-disclosure work, I think is really important. But that's a balance. It's tricky.
Thank you so much, Celia and Erin. And we just lost Sherelle. She had to leave, so I just want to Say thank you to Sherelle. That was an amazing presentation. Okay, let's see. So for Faith, Bill, and Joe, let's see. Okay, it sounds like your rubric hasn't been officially used or approved. So do you anticipate any pushback or opposition? I would expect opposition if I mentioned anything like this at my institution, says the questioner.
I think we're prepared for some opposition, but this is San Francisco for one case. And we are a library that has gone through a staffing revolution recently. We've had many retirements and brought in many new people. And in our hiring, we really have been thinking about anti-racist and critical issues. So we're bringing in people, I think, who are going to be more or less on our side on this. So we expect nearly everyone to really be interested in trying this out.
And just to add to what Bill said, the elements of the rubric are intended to be strength-based, to borrow a social worker's phrase, not overly critical. So we hope that in that process that of reflection, that we can bring some folks along that would maybe be reticent without that element of strength-based.
Yeah, I think that sort of design is an important part of it. The category is this isn't here but could be included. That's not going to be marked for everything, right? It's sort of like, hey, here's an opportunity that we'd like to suggest, rather than you aren't doing this, you aren't doing this, you aren't doing this. It's more, yeah, I think Joe's phrase of strength-based is really key. And the other thing is, that's the other reason why we approached it from a research place, right? If somebody says, well, I don't agree with that, we can say, well, here's the literature. Feel free to bring in other research that might say something different. Let's have a research-based discussion around these things, rather than just sort of like, that feels hard, or I'm not interested in that. We're trying to ground it in research. But yeah, I think like Joe, like Bill said, I think most people will be into it, but we'll see.
And I think one also thing is that because everything on here is optional, and there's such a wide variety of things, people will find a few items that make sense to them on there that they might want to include. There's not a lot to push back on. If there's something you don't want to do, you just don't do it.
Yeah, and some people could use it as a peer observation, or some could use it as a way to reflect on their teaching and try to build going forward. So there's a couple of options there. So it's a little bit more flexible than it may appear.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to highlight a comment in the chat that people want to try everything that has been discussed today. And also there's a lot of appreciation for the timely work that is directed to answering the how question rather than just the why question of critical topics. So kudos to everyone. And I will ask one more question to Linnea, and then we're going to take a break before our next session. All right, so Linnea, the credit bearing, so non-one-shot aspect of your work seems really important. Do you think that your science fiction critical literacy stories could easily be adapted to a one-shot instruction model?
Okay, so I had some ideas about how to bring this into programming. I'm not sure if it would fit in the one shot as much, but this would definitely work for any kind of like, another thing that I had my students do in the English class was watch The Matrix. And I think that like The Matrix ties into so much of what we're doing in critical information literacy. And I feel like showing movies or even episodes of Doctor Who or something like that and having a discussion about that with students would be really fun. And then the other thing that I thought of was just like a short story book club, because college students have very little time, and like that would be another way to share these ideas. I don't think that it would work as well in the one shot, because basically there would be no time for the students to like have read the story unless you ask the professor to share it with them ahead of time. Thanks, that's a great question.
Thank you, Linnea. And thank you to all of the Lightning Talk speakers for your fantastic presentations. So everybody, please join me in giving them a round of virtual applause, clap emojis all around. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to take a 5-minute break and we will resume at 11 with our next presentation. And at that point, I'll be handing it over to the lovely Corliss Lee, who will be our moderator. So again, thank you so much, Lightning Talk speakers. I learned so much and really enjoyed all of your presentations. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.